Shall I begin, ma'am?
Yeah,
Yes.
begin Sudhalakshmi. Now it is over to Sudhalakshmi.
Thank you, ma'am. A warm and pleasant noon to everyone. I'm Dr. Sudha Lakshmi. On behalf of PG and Research Department of English, I'm pleased to welcome you to all to the afternoon session of Diaspora Across Time and Space, Multifarious Understandings of Indian Diaspora Literature. I extend my gracious welcome to Professor Jasmina Luki, the keynote speaker of this session. Welcome you, ma'am. Here is a small introduction of Professor Dr. Jasmina Luki. She is a professor with the Department of Gender Studies at the Central European University in Budapest, Hungary. She has an MA from Carleton University and a PhD from University of Belgrade in Comparative Literature. She is teaching courses in feminist theory and literary studies and supervising several MA and PhD students. She has participated in several European university-funded projects and contributed as editor to several feminist journals. She has added feathers to her cap by publishing books that include monographs Metaphrosa, Sitanje Zandra, and Grudge Lies. Numerous other articles and book chapters on women literature, transnational literature, and Slavic studies are also included. She has recently published the book Times of Mobility, Transnational Literature and Gender in Translation with Sabalian Ferrester and Barbara Ferrago as co-editors. It's our pleasure to have you here, ma'am. May I request Professor Jasmina Luki to deliver her keynote address for this session. Please, ma'am, the floor is yours. Over to Professor Jasmina Luki.
Thank you very much. And before starting my talk, I would like to, first of all, thank you, the organizers, for this very kind invitation. And I would like in particular to thank Professor Singh, who has invited me particularly to this conference, whom I know from his previous visits to Budapest and his research stay with our department. And I'm very happy to reconnect participating in this conference again. As you might have seen in the program, the title of my talk is Thinking Transnationally, or How I Learned About Joydeep Roy Bhattacharya. And I would like to start with an observation which probably the other participants in this conference also had, referring to this particular moment in which this conference is happening and the way it is being organized. That is via internet, and referring to the place from which I'm speaking, and that is from the heart of Budapest and the heart of Central European University and the heart of Central and Eastern Europe. And in a number of ways, I think that these are additional elements which are framing the topic that I would like to talk about. In the kind introduction to my work, the volume that just appeared at the moment when the whole COVID crisis has started, entitled Times of Mobility, Literature and Gender in Translation, has been mentioned. And I am actually, I want to underline the way in which this title, until early March, was telling in one way about the times we live in, referring to mass migrations, diaspora, and the way we were living, really feeling that the world is small and accessible at any moment and in any point of the globe. And then almost overnight, this very title became an ironic paraphrase of itself, indicating how deeply and how profoundly our world might have changed and might have changed overnight. And looking at these two different meanings of the very same title, which was meant to indicate one thing, and in the end, it started referring to a very different situation, I actually want to make a claim, which is the starting point for my talk today. And that is that I think that this particular pandemic situation is bringing back into the focus a discussion on transnational literature, and the part of that discussion I would like to bring for your consideration today. As you all might know, transnational literature and discussions around transnationalism, transnational turn, and in particular transnational literature have been quite a lot in focus since the 1990s and in 2000s. And then somehow the topic of transnationalism as a part of discussions on globalization did lose a little bit its momentum, but I think it is coming back, particularly in this situation in which we have seen that borders that we thought were not so important have been erased all over overnight. Flights that have been a regular part of our lives have been landed, and we had to, and we have to, and probably will have to rethink the ways in which our ideas of mobility have been assumed to be a part of our lives. So I think that both transnationality as a category and the concept of transnational literature come back in order to help us understand how to rethink and renegotiate a number of aspects of this new situation, which in many ways it is experienced for the first time in our lives. When our university closed, and yours probably as well, one of the things I was telling our students when we continued working online was that once they grow old, they will be able to tell their children, grandchildren, and friends how they lived through something that happened for the first time in history. And I thought of that to be an encouragement for them. So let's see what kind of conceptual apparatus that we have can help us think through what we are experiencing now, linking our previous knowledge to the situation in which a kind of new knowledge production is required. But before I focus particularly on literature, since I'm talking at the conference organized by a women's college, I would like to say something about transnational perspective in another framework, and that is framework of global feminism. As a researcher from Central and Eastern Europe, Sylvia Schultermann puts it, transnational feminism has had many great impacts on the development of a different global look at women's histories, feminist activism, and gender inequalities. Its primary task is to bring a feminist sensibility to intercultural exchange and academic cross-fertilization. It is a heuristic more than it is an academic field, but a heuristic with an established canon of seminal text. As it is well known, the role of feminist theorists coming from India like Inderpal Grewal and Chandratalpade Mohanty is seminal in creating this canon. And this is also the canon I'm keeping in mind while thinking about transnational perspective in literary studies. So starting from their work and including the work of many others, transnational feminist scholarship since the early 1990s has developed an impressive body of knowledge which brought together a number of related theories and approaches, from border studies to post-colonial studies to diaspora and migration studies, while keeping in focus the need for feminist theorists to investigate critically not only power inequalities in society, but also among feminists themselves. Having said that, I also want to add that transnational perspective is not one. It goes in very different disciplinary and topical directions. And as Laura Briggs points out, transnationalism is not an uncontested term, as transnational feminism is not an uncontested approach within the larger field of women's and gender studies. But leaving these debates aside, I would like to emphasize here one of the key characteristics of transnational feminism, which in my view is becoming particularly important at this very moment we live in. It offers an interpretative framework in which a more specific and a more general perspective interact, calling for a dialogue between them. Or to put it differently, it brings together local and global, offering tools to understand various ways in which they are co-constitutive in each and particular case. This relation is examined also by Susan Stanford Friedman in an essay in which she argues for a concept of locational feminism. In a text with the same name, Friedman calls for reinstitution of feminism in the singular, which does not aim to erase differences between women, social conditions they live in, and feminist traditions they have created, but to emphasize that various forms of feminism share the same political practice based upon theories of gender and social justice. In order to make a distinction in regards to the old forms of essentialism in feminist theory, Friedman introduces the term locational feminism, which is both local and global, always located in particular spaces with an emphasis on local specificities and trans-local connections. Feminism is also a global phenomenon in the way its indigenous formations are created and also in the way they travel, influencing one another. Thus, the concept of locational feminism acknowledges the historically and geographically specific forms in which feminism emerges, takes root, changes, travels, translates, and transplants in different spatial and temporal contexts. And that was a direct quotation from the article of Susan Friedman. Friedman emphasizes that feminism can be understood only through the interaction of these multiple origins and locations, since, and I'm quoting again, the notion that a given social order privileges the masculine does not, I believe, says Friedman, have a single origin equity, nor does the advocacy of gender. Rather, these constitutive components of locational feminism have emerged differently in particular times and places and have traveled from one culture to another, producing hybridic cultural formations of indigenous feminism influenced by other traveling forms of feminism. Such syncretic practices result from ongoing processes of what anthropologists often call transculturation, whereby one culture absorbs and redefines within its own terms what it takes from others as an effect of multiple contact zones. End of the quote. And I am including this rather long quote here because it is making a couple of important points for my talk. And one of them is a reference on transculturation, which I'm going to use a bit later and come back to that problem a bit later on in this talk. And exactly because these processes of transculturation that Susan Friedman refers to actually call for transnational perspective as a productive theoretical framework for interpretation of complex problems they necessarily are connected with, or they raise for their attention. It is particularly obvious in literary studies where massive migration that characterize our time have created huge body of cultural texts that defy more traditional taxonomies and categorizations. And when I'm speaking about massive migration, I would like to invoke here Arjuna Padurai and his study Modernity at Large, and his claim that actually the way we experience migration is different again from what we know from history due to a particular linkage or connection between massive migration and new technologies, which are changing the way migration is being imagined as well as experienced by a large number of people. And in a number of ways, Appadurai's book was written at the very end of previous century, and I keep on coming back to it, seeing it as a prophetic in a number of ways. So this massive migration is one of important elements or are important contributing factors to creation of this body of cultural texts that call for different thinking about the way we organize literary studies and we think about literature more generally. The number of authors who defy all kinds of borders, including national borders and national canons, who belong to more than one tradition and more than one culture, often find themselves in what Dubravka Ugrešić herself, a transnational writer from Europe, calls an out-of-nation zone, as she says, best abbreviated as on zone. And let me quote again from one of her essays. Ugrešić says, writers who have either chosen to live in on zone or been forced to seek its shelter need more oxygen than provided by translation into foreign languages alone. For a bloody literary life, such writers need inter alia an imaginary library, a context in which their work might be located. Because more often than not, such work floats free in a kind of limbo. The construction of a context or a literary and theoretical platform, a theoretical raft that might accommodate the dislocated and deterritorialized, the transnational and anational, cross-cultural, transcultural writers, cosmopolitans, neo-nomads, and literary vagabonds, those who write in adopted languages, in newly acquired languages, in multiple languages, in mother tongues, in non-maternal habitats. All those who have voluntarily undergone the process of dispatriation, much work on the construction of such a context remains. The end of the quote. And this is a part of an essay in which she is arguing, as she does in a number of other essays, for a new kind of literary theory, a new kind of thinking about literature that would be based on a concept of transnationalism. So as a transnational writer, an exile, an expat who is defying the identity as the primary way of looking at a writer and his or her work, she is actually also acting as a literary scholar who calls for new concepts that would be developed in order to address this new body of cultural texts. So transnational literature and theories that are built around the concept of transnational literature, in her view, and I have to say in my view as a literary critic, can offer the framework to build such a context. And I also want to add here that her call or her claim that the writers who are living as migrant writers and write outside the nation, as she says, need to have a virtual library is also a claim that points to an important aspect of thinking transnationally in literary studies, and that is a need to rethink canons and the way canons are being produced. If we are thinking about the concept of transnational literature, it obviously needs to be considered in regards to several related concepts that are currently framing discussions on literary taxonomies in our globalized world. And by saying this, I want to add that I am also referring to Mike Ball and her book, Traveling Concepts, where she is emphasizing that concepts never work in isolation, but actually in clusters, coming together to address the problems that actually they can help us think about. And in this case, I want, while on the one hand, the concept of transnational literature obviously evokes related concepts like border, diaspora, migration. On the other hand, if we are talking and thinking about it as a category in literary theory, it has to be related with the concepts like national literature, comparative literature, and world literature. And in a previous occasion, I have discussed more in detail the relation between these concepts. So here, I would just like to emphasize that I don't find them to be mutually exclusive in any way, but actually concepts which are working together to address rather different set of problems. And in that sense, I would like to go back to Franco Moretti and the distinction he makes between national literature and world literature. And the distinction he makes also includes his reflection on the nature of comparative literature. Franco Moretti speaks about world literature as a planetary system, and not as an object, but as he emphasizes it as a problem. And Franco Moretti, speaking about world literature, underlines that, seen as a problem, world literature asks for a new critical method. So there is obviously a shared feeling on the side of writers who are represented here by Dubravka Ugrasic, as well as on the side of literary theorists, that a new critical method is needed in order to think about literature in our globalized world. Moretti himself emphasizes again that world literature cannot be more of the same. It is not the concept which goes back to the concept which we can trace back to Goethe as a collection of great works, but in a very different direction. He actually wants to make the difference between national literature and world literature using two very telling metaphors. One of them is a metaphor of a tree, and the other is a metaphor of waves. So tree is taken as signifier, or if you want a metaphorical picture of national literature. And it, as Moretti says, describes the passage from unity to diversity. National literature is, by the rule, seen as one tree with many branches. On the other hand, the idea of the wave, the image of the wave, is quite opposite. It is actually, again, as Moretti says, it observes uniformity engulfing the initial diversity. So I'm quoting now, this then is the basis for the division of labor between national and world literature. National literature for people who see trees, world literature for people who see waves. Division of labor and challenge. The products of cultural history are always composite ones, but which is the dominant mechanism in their composition? And just to make it a bit shorter, the internal or the external one, the nation or the world, the tree or the wave. There is no way to settle the controversy once and for all, fortunately. And I have to say, I love very much this point, because comparativists need controversy, says Moretti. The point is that there is no other justification for the study of world literature and for the existence of the departments of comparative literature, but this, to be a thorn in the side, a permanent intellectual challenge to national literatures. It would take a lot of time, end of the quote. It would take a lot of time to develop here a more detailed analysis of the implications of this claim, and in particular of the role of comparative literature as described here, with world literature as the main object of its study. Going from here, I want to add that in my view, transnational literature as a term breaks this dual opposition, since it speaks to both systems, that of national literature and that of world literature. More precisely, transnational literature as a term and as a concept enables us to speak about various literary phenomena that cannot be addressed within the larger frame of world literature. And it is not by chance that Moretti requires a particular method to approach it, which is in his interpretation, the so-called distant reading. Transnational literature can be more focused in its tasks in a number of ways when it comes to particular regions, ethnic groups, historical contexts, or even topics to be addressed. On the significance of the so-called transnational turn in literary studies, Susan Friedman wrote on a number of occasions, among others in the volume Times of Mobility I have mentioned earlier, where she also looks into relations between national and comparative literature from transnational perspective, and emphasizes that it is important to recognize that national has always existed within a larger temporal and geographical scale of transnational and cross-border interactions and cross-fertilizations, end of short quote. Only in Friedman's case, the transnational perspective is tightly related to new readings of cosmopolitanism initiated by all forms of migration that became one of the key characteristics of our time. The term transnational literature has been more widely introduced in literary studies by American Turkish scholar Azadeh Seyhan, and I'm intentionally emphasizing here her own transnational origin. She introduces the term in her book, Writing Outside the Nation, it's obvious where Ugrasic takes her formulation on zone later on. Azadeh speaks there about a new culture of transnational, bilingual, and multilingual literature that has arisen with multiple migration waves that occurred in the last century. And she proposes the study of transnational literature, which is in the first place focused on those who write outside the nation. And I quote, "I understand transnational literature as a genre of writing that operates outside the national canon, addresses issues facing deterritorialized cultures, and speaks for those in what I call paranational communities and alliances." It is easy to see how a writer like Dubravka Ugrasic can recognize herself here. In art and literature, continuing the quote, ethnicity is often a self-proclaimed form of cultural identification. In literary texts, ethnicity is recognizable as a linguistic mode, cultural idiom, or discursive practice. Nevertheless, the term ethnic literature implies that its signified is not an integral or natural part of a land's literary history. The same is true of immigrant literature. The end of quote. Seyhan Azadeh is very much focused on migrant literature, together with the term transnational. That is why she also uses terms like exilic. Emphasis is on voluntary and not on forced migration. This last distinction, voluntary and not forced migration, as it is well known from migration studies, opens a number of hard to solve problems. But leaving the problem of definitions aside, it is important to see that the state of exile or diasporic condition that Azadeh relates here to with transnational literature brings with itself a whole repertoire of privileged topics. They include the questions of identity, of memory, feeling of loss, and a language and the related language issues. The last topic has particular significance since Azadeh Seyhan has primarily been interested in the authors writing in another language, which is not their own. In her later work, she actually has loosened up this initial definition of transnational literature as literature written in the second language, and opened the discussion towards more complicated and more inclusive thinking of what can be seen as transnational literature. But the problem of language is also immediately raising a problem of translation as an inherent aspect of thinking about transnational literature. Italian theorists Vita Fortunati and Leonora Federici are reflecting about relations between transnational literature and translation, pairing transnational and translational in a very telling way. They are pointing to the situation of transnational writer as a situation which always involves a kind of language choice, be it a maternal one or an acquired language, and pointing to different parameters which are affecting such a choice, from aesthetic to very practical ones. But these choices are necessarily complex one, and when we speak about transnational literature, we see that they often lead to mixing of languages and code switching, which becomes an aesthetic tool in itself, as much as it can be a way to make political and ethical statement in transnational texts. And I would like to remember here just one of the foundational texts for, in a number of ways, for border studies, for feminist theory, for migration studies, Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands, La Frontera, and the way in which Anzaldúa is mixing English and Spanish to produce a very particular new linguistic code. Federici and Fortunati emphasized that the question of language and the language choice is especially important for women. And it is related with the way how women as a social group are experiencing migration and how it is then reflected in the way they write about their experiences. And again, I want to remind you here that autobiographical discourses for a number of decades now and still are a kind of privileged form used by women writers. And that also goes for women writers speaking about migration. Federici and Fortunati in addressing also reflective of culture's wider dimensions. Moving to Friedman, from Fortunati and Federici, I'm moving to Friedman, who is also discussing issues of translation, and that's her emphasis that language is constitutive of culture, but also a reflection of culture's wider dimension. And that is why translation is never a purely linguistic act. Translation always carries with itself a larger context and refers to power relations on all levels of society. And this is something which we also need to keep in mind talking about transnationalism. So for Friedman, this is one of strong points which relates concept of translation with the processes of transculturation. And I want to bring it back into the discussion of transnationalism. So we are coming here back to the question of contact zones and to the relation between transnationalism, transculturation, and the way that can offer transnational literature a productive framework to address complex problems in spaces in which all number of borders have been both challenged and erected. And I am intentionally setting that order, having in mind the moment we live in. And speaking of the borders, I am thinking not only on geographical borders, I'm thinking of symbolic borders of all kinds, which is something we have to look at, and which is also a topic for transnational thinking as well. Just to remind ourselves here that the concept of transculturalism has been developed by a Cuban theorist, Fernando Ortiz, and that it is with us for quite a long time, proving to be a vital tool in addressing exactly these problems of the way how interaction in what we call here contact zones addresses both issues of powers, but also issues of inequalities from the perspective of transnational studies and transnational literature. The transculturation offers the one more useful tool to problematize the processes of homogenizing social group within the concept of nation as a constructed collectivity where potentially differences between various ethnic groups can be easily erased. So what it is in the end that we translate when we deal with transnational literature? I would like to say that we translate obviously more than just using the dictionary. We actually translate the whole cultural patterns, and we have to engage in our translation and the processes of translation, what Umberto Eco has called an encyclopedia of knowledge, which is behind the given text. In a larger version of this talk, I had the whole part on the way how possible world theories come here and how Lubomir Doležal's concept of literary transduction can be used to address the question of translation in transnational perspective. I'm not sure if I have time to do that, and if you find it interesting, I might address that maybe later in the discussion. But I would like here to shorten my paper, omitting that particular discussion, and to come back to Dubravka Ugrešić as a writer who is important here and who will be bringing me back to the topic of my lecture, as you are going to see very soon. To say very shortly a few words on Dubravka Ugrešić herself, coming from former Yugoslavia, where also I am coming from, she is a writer who was known as a strong opponent to nationalism in the early 1990s and a strong voice against wars in the times of the wars for Yugoslav secession, which led to breakup of the common country. Being attacked as a proponent of anti-nationalism and as a strong voice against war, Dubravka Ugrešić, after going through a very strong media lynch, as she says in another essay, took her own broom, which she bought for her own money, and left the country. The broom is important here because she was accused to be one of the, in a famous case, one of 5 Croatian witches, one of 5 women, 5 feminists, who were exactly put through media lynching because of their anti-war public standing. Since the early 1990s, Dubravka Ugrešić lives as a writer who defies national identity and identification, and lives now finally in Amsterdam, used to live in a number of other places in the early 1990s, and is known for as a very strong voice of the feminist, as a feminist woman writer who calls for thinking differently and thinking against any kind of reading literature for ideological purposes. So I would like to go back to her work, and particularly her essayistic work here, to illustrate some of these points. In her already quoted essay on zone, Ugrešić uses her own example to describe how geographic and symbolic borders operate in the field of literature. I'm quoting now. Let's imagine for a moment that someone sends me and the fellow writer, let's call him Dexter, to the North Pole to each write an essay about our trip. Let's also imagine coincidence. Dexter and I turn from our trip with exactly the same text. Dexter's position doesn't require translation. It is a universal one. Dexter is the representative of Anglo-American letters, the dominant feature of our time. My position will be translated as Balkan, post-Yugoslav, Croatian, and of course female. All told, a particular and specific one. My description of the white expanse will be quickly imbued with projected, i.e. invented content. Custom officers will cross Baxter whether in the white expanse he encountered the metaphysical. Astounding that I don't live at home, quotation marks, they will ask me why I live in Amsterdam, how it is that I, of all people, got sent to the North Pole. This is one of many examples where she is very strongly voicing the question of identity and problematizing the way the question of identity is taken as interpretative tool, dividing writers according to their origin and setting them in the context in which their work needs and has to be interpreted. She, on a number of occasions, she defied to identify herself and said that she is nobody and she's going to be nobody as long as even an eyebrow of the last clerk in the last office, in the last place of the world is going to be raised when she says that she's nobody. Here again, she calls for critical rethinking on the ways in which literature functions institutionally, both on national and on a global level. Her claims concern literary critics as much as literary scholarship, literary awards, as much as various bodies that are offering funding for writers and students of literature. When she speaks about those issues, she always speaks as an exile or as a migrant writer or as a writer who speaks from a margin. Somebody who has renounced the security of home and the shelter of national literature, arguing, as she does here as well, that those are deceiving interpretative frameworks which in the end lead to some kind of misunderstanding, misreading, and misinterpretation. In an essay with the indicative title, What is European in European Literature, Dubravka Ugrešić speaks mockingly about relevance of national identity for identity of an author, but recognizes that this is a trap hard to avoid. Quoting, 10 years ago, I held Yugoslav passport with its soft, pliable, dark red cover. I was a Yugoslav writer. Then the war came, and the Croats, without so much as by your leave, shoveled a blue Croatian passport at me. Croatian passport in hand, I abandoned my newly acquired and formerly demolished homeland and set out into the world. With impassioned Eurosong-like glee, the rest of the world identified me as a Croatian writer. I became a literary representative of a place that no longer wanted me. Again, I hold a passport with a soft, pliable, dark red cover, a Dutch passport. Will this new passport make me a Dutch writer? It may, but I doubt it. Now that I have a Dutch passport, will I ever be able to reintegrate it to the ranks of Croatian writers? Possibly, but I doubt it. What is my real problem? Am I ashamed of my label of Croatian writer that still trails after me? No. Would I feel any better with a label like Gucci or Armani? Undoubtedly I would, but that's not the point. I'm bringing here this rather long quotation because it points clearly to a set of interrelated problems that we find at the core of the more recent writings of Dubravka Ugrešić. Critical examination of the role of literature, the status of writers in the world dominated by popular and mass culture, and the significance of concept of identity that has been given in the current interpretative practices and in cultural politics that structures life of literature as a social institution. Just a second. And in order to both expose and to mock the rigidity of the logic behind these categories, Ugrešić undermines the concept of national literature, showing at the same time that the so-called politics of location in the globalized world works differently in regards with the origin of writers. In the so-called Western literary market, domestic authors do not have such a strong baggage of imposed national identities as it is the case with all those who are considered to be the others. Being herself the author from Central Eastern Europe, she is often in a position to see the difference. Authors coming from abroad are expected to foster their group identity and to represent their communities. They are not supposed to be the only writers, but writers from somewhere, exoticized others who can be easily recognized and labeled for the market through their specific topics. As long as someone who is Moroccan lays out something which is Moroccan, says Ugrešić, whatever it means, and we lay out something European, whatever it means, all is right with the world. That is how cultural products are exchanged. For the most part, that is how the market works. But everything would indeed be right in the world, again, says Ugrešić, if there were no non-mainstream individuals, dysfunctional clogs in the mechanism, people who erode the stereotypes about culture, about who they are and who they are supposed to be. And in answering to the question, what is European in European literature, Ugrešić responds in the following. Among the dysfunctions of the existing literary system, I have my favorite example. Joydeep Roy Bhattacharya was born in Calcutta. He left India when he was 20. He earned a degree in philosophy in the United States, lives in New York. Joydeep wrote a novel. The theme of his novel is Hungary and the circle of Hungarian intellectuals of the 1960s. The Hungarians promptly translated the book. A Hungarian intellectual grumbled to me that the novel deals with Hungary, but in an Indian way. It would have been better for him to write about India, he commented. In the world in which the identity kit has become something like toothbrush, an essential which you cannot do without, Joydeep has chosen the most arduous path. So in answer to the question of what would be the European in European literature, I say, Dubravka says, it is Mr. Bhattacharya, an Indian man born in Calcutta who lives in New York and writes about Europe, end of quotation. So this is how I got to know Joydeep Roy Bhattacharya through a transnational woman writer, Dubravka Ugrešić. Thank you very much for your attention.
So, Jasmina, thanks for giving such a nice lecture and introducing us to a new dimension of diaspora, that is transnationalism. And you explained transnationalism in a very, very effective manner. Now, the session is open for discussion. If anybody has any question, you can put it in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and you can ask.
There is a question in chat box.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me, just a second, let me open the chat box. I don't see where it is.
Yeah, I can read a few questions for you. Are women felt
Yes,
more
please.
cultural displacement than men? Are women felt more cultural displacement than men? Please comment on this.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. It is a part of a much wider set of questions of how experience of migration is being gendered in a number of ways. So what happens when certain social groups are moving, what happens when certain individuals are moving, under which conditions, what is the situation of women in a particular migratory situation. So there is not a simple answer to that question, but there is an important aspect to be taken into consideration when we are talking about migration and diaspora, and that is how gender comes to be considered as an important element of the whole experience. And this is the point where I would like to say that I think this is also a question where it becomes clear that the intersectional perspective is important and relevant, not only when we are dealing with social reality, but also when we are dealing with cultural texts speaking about migration and about personal experiences of migration, be it in autobiographical, some kind of autobiographical form, or in a fictional form. I have often heard from my colleagues who are sociologists that they tend to use novels to explain intersectionality. And I think that intersectional approach, which would put gender in relation with other categories of identity and other aspects of social oppression, is very helpful in understanding and interpreting these particular situations.
There is one more question, Jasmina. Would you consider diaspora as a contact zone for human beings and non-human species? Is diaspora studies to some degree speciesist?
I think that posthumanism is for sure one way to think about the number of problems and to bring back into thinking about hard questions that diaspora studies necessarily open up for us. I am not myself working extensively in the framework of posthumanism, but I find it highly relevant for one aspect of both literary studies and diaspora and migration studies, and this is the question of ethics, and it is the question of new kind of responsibility that we have to establish and think about when it comes to the basic questions that have to be addressed. and that we as a humanity have to face in the times we live in. The choices we are making and the statements the positions we are taking. So it helps us rethink what does it mean to be human in the world we live in.
So these were the questions. Now there are only compliments. Nice presentation and informative session. Thanks for answering the questions.
Sir,
Very
there is one
informative
more
and
question.
enriching session.
Sir, there is one more question.
Yes, ma'am, you can ask that. If you can
There,
see.
it is in the chat box, sir, comparing the magic realism.
Yeah, please explain diaspora with magic realism.
Sorry, I didn't get you.
It says, please explain diaspora with magic realism.
Well, thank you for the question. It's a big one, and I don't think there is a simple answer. I can only say that I think magic realism has become a powerful tool in translating all kinds of experiences into fictional format. I did not have time to bring in Lubomir Doležal here. It would require another 15 or 20 minutes at least to talk, but I am going to recall Doležal here to make one point, and that is that for me, literary texts always keep a certain level of autonomy and can never be fully translated into any other form of discourses, or cannot be fully translated to a kind of lived experience. So they speak about the real experience, they talk to us, they can be related to lived experience, but they have particular ways to do that. And magical realism is one of the tools to create fictional worlds which have, as Doležal would put it, their own discrete ontology. Magical realism is not only aesthetically powerful, it is also a very strong way to show that fictional worlds are fictional, and we have to read them as fictional, which does not mean disconnected from us and disconnected from our experiences, but they have ontological status of their own. I hope that is answering your question.
Yeah, thanks for explaining things so so efficiently. So if there are any other questions, if there is anyone who wants to ask any question. Yeah. Now only compliments. Very good presentation and very informative.
Thank you very much. It was really my honor to be a part of your conference, and thank you again for the invitation.
Yeah. So now I hand over the chance to Sudha Lakshmi.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
I am online. Thank you, sir. A very big thanks to Professor Jasmina Lukic for her enlightening speech on Think Transnationally, or How I Learned About Joy D. Roy Bhattacharya. Thank you, ma'am. You have definitely imparted great new knowledge on the difference between the transnationalism and nationalism and transnationalism and transculturalism in literature. Thanks a lot, ma'am. I request the participants and audience to gather again at 2:15 sharp for the next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much again for inviting me. It was a pleasure to participate.
It's our pleasure, Jasmina, to host you. And I wish we will have more sessions with you in coming times.
I hope there will be a chance to cooperate more in the future.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm leaving now,
Yeah,
and all
thank you.
best.
Yeah, thank you. So nice of you. It's
Bye.
a very pleasant experience to see you face to face in the virtual world after such a long time.
Yes, and same to you, and I wish you all the best
Yeah.
and a very successful conference.
Thank you.
Bye.
Sir,
Yes, ma'am.
can we join at 2:15 or we will be?
Mm, there are two ways. One, we can just continue it,
Okay.
and another way is no. I just end this meeting and restart it at 2:50.
Yeah, we can restart the meeting.
Okay.
Okay.
So I'm ending the meeting immediately so that we can restart in
Yeah,
another time.
again we'll enter.